Amazing Monsters, Big Nose, by Jim Slater, illustrated by Christopher Slater. One cold winter's day, Mr. Amazing was walking in the woods when he noticed a strange green thing sticking out of the snow. "This looks like some kind of plant," he said to himself. Mr. Amazing rushed home and came back with a shovel. "Now I'll find out what it is," Mr. Amazing said as he began to shovel away the snow. Suddenly the green thing gave 2 tiny sneezes. Achoo! Achoo! Then a little monster stood up and shook the rest of the snow from her bright green body. "I've never seen a monster of this kind before," Mr. Amazing thought. "She looks like a small elephant, but she stands on 2 legs instead of 4. I wonder why she has that hole in her nose." Mr. Amazing took the monster home with him. "Oh dear," his wife said, "she's shivering. She may have a cold. We must put her to bed immediately." The following morning, Mrs. Amazing was amazed. "Come quickly," she called to her husband. "The monster has had twins." Mr. Amazing rushed in to see the baby monsters. "They're both boys," he said. "I think we should call the bigger one Robert." "What a good idea," Mrs. Amazing replied. "And let's name the smaller one Stanley." Mr. Amazing asked a friend of his to come to his house. Mr. Astonishing was very famous and knew even more about monsters than Mr. Amazing. "I want to know what kind of monsters they are," Mr. Amazing said, "and why they have a hole in their nose." Mr. Astonishing checked through his monster book. "This is the one," he said, pointing to a picture on page 93. "Magnus Nassus, usually known as Big Nose." "What's the hole for?" Mr. Amazing asked. "That's a kind of spanner. It comes in handy for loosening bolts, and the ends of their fingers and nose are like screwdrivers. When they are young, big noses like to take things to pieces." "Oh dear," sighed Mrs. Amazing. "Don't worry," Mr. Astonishing said. "They always leave the parts neatly stacked." Monsters. Magnus Nassus. This bright green monster is usually known as Big Nose. Young big noses take things to pieces. They use the hole in their noses as a spanner and the end of their noses and fingers as screwdrivers. They are very tidy monsters and always neatly stack the parts of things they take to pieces. The following day, Mrs. Amazing called to her husband. "Come and see. Robert's taken the television to pieces." Robert looked very proud as he stood by the small pile of television parts. Stanley just sat quietly by his mother. The next morning after breakfast, Mr. Amazing kissed his wife goodbye. "I'm going into town," he said. "I'll use the car." But Mr. Amazing had to travel by train. Robert had taken the car to pieces the night before. The parts were neatly stacked in the garage. 3 days later, a policeman called at Mr. Amazing's house. "I'm sorry to trouble you, sir," he said, "but I have reason to believe you own a small green monster." "Yes, I do," Mr. Amazing replied. "Well, how do you explain this?" the policeman asked, showing him a photograph of Robert taking a bus to pieces. "He ran off when the night watchman shouted at him. He left the parts neatly stacked, but it's going to take a long time to put the bus together again." Mr. Amazing had to promise the police that he would look after his big noses much more carefully in the future. After that he hardly let them out of his sight during the day, and he put some iron bars on their bedroom window to stop them from escaping at night. Robert boasted about all the things he had taken apart. He kept strutting proudly around the living room, while his brother just sat by his mother's side. Stanley didn't say anything. He was busy thinking. The following evening, Mr. and Mrs. Amazing looked into the Big Nose's bedroom to say good night. Mrs. Big Nose and Robert were fast asleep, but Stanley's bed was empty. "He must have crept out while we were having supper," Mrs. Amazing said. "I do hope he doesn't do anything silly," Mr. Amazing replied. "He's such a small big nose. I'm worried about him." Mr. Amazing needn't have worried about Stanley. He should have been worrying about Big Ben, the huge clock tower in the middle of London. That night Stanley took Big Ben to pieces. He left the parts neatly stacked, but it took 15 men working night and day for a week to put the clock together again. Now that Robert and Stanley are grown-up big noses, they don't take things apart anymore. The Big Nose family has moved out of Mr. Amazing's house and lives happily in the woods nearby. If you ever meet the big noses, remember, the small one is Stanley. Make a fuss over him. Sometimes small, quiet big noses are just as clever as big, boastful ones.